Day programme on BBC Radio 4.
David Steele, Charles Kennedy, Ming Campbell, all Liberal leaders, of course, all Scots. But now the Liberal Democrats have just one Scottish MP, and there are few signs of the revival the party was hoping for, either here in Scotland or indeed down south. The party has presented itself as the party of Remain, but even The Economist magazine, which surprisingly gave the party its backing this week, says it is heading for, quotes, a dreadful defeat. Willie Rennie, leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, joins us on the line from Fife.
What an introduction, Nick.
Good morning to you. So, well, you know, why? What's gone wrong? What can you get right in the remaining 6 days?
Well, let me contradict you slightly, because actually in the seats that I'm going to in Scotland, where it's a straight choice between the Liberal Democrats and the SNP, we're doing exceptionally well. So I've been in North East Fife just yesterday, knocking on doors in Ming Campbell's old seat in St Andrews, and there was lots of people who were traditionally Conservatives are coming our way, Labour coming our way. In fact, people who were fed up with the SNP and their performance in government are coming our way too. And the big issue, Nick, is around about independence, because that's the big defining issue in Scotland. Do people want to reject another divisive independence referendum before it even happens? And they're coming our way in those seats because of that exact issue.
Well, it's intriguing that you say it's the big defining issue, because, of course, Brexit is also a big defining issue as well. Let's deal with independence first, though. If you're really pro-union in Scotland, most people will think that they should vote for the Tories, won't they? And Ruth Davidson, who's making this fight. And your problem is on that issue, you're not seen as the main choice, and on Brexit in the UK as a whole, you're not seen as the main choice.
Yeah, but with our voting system, it's effectively 59 different by-elections across the country, you know, and there's a number of seats in the Highlands, in the Central Belt, in the North East, where Liberal Democrats have traditionally been very strong, and we came a good second last time round, and we've got a good chance of overcoming those majorities. So, for instance, in Eastern Bartonshire, a couple of thousand votes behind, and we've got a good chance of taking that seat back. Edinburgh West, 3,000. So there's seats like that right across the country, where it's not the Tories that people have got the choice to vote for, it's the Liberal Democrats.
Okay. Can you solve a puzzle for us? Here you are, nationally, calling for a second referendum on membership of the EU, at least on the terms of any Brexit deal. But in Scotland, you're saying there must not be a second referendum on independence.
Well, I mean, on Brexit, we think it's such a monumental issue that because we started the process with democracy, we should end it with democracy. People should have the right to reject a bad deal when it's finally agreed with Europe. You know, it should be the British people to decide, not Theresa May. So that's the view you'll have heard from Tim Farron on a number of occasions, but it's the right to reject a bad deal. Because in Scotland, we rejected that bad deal 3 years ago. And look what's happened since. The oil price has plummeted. We've got a massive issue in terms of the deficit of £15 billion between what we raise and what we spend. But also the shine has come off the SNP Scottish Government, and people want to get them on with a day job.
You may say that, though. You can point out, as it were, all the things that went wrong on that side. But people who are pro-independence are perfectly entitled to say to you, well, hold on, we didn't even know we were voting about staying in the UK after it left Brexit. The terms have changed, the deal has changed, we should have another vote.
Yeah, but 3 years ago, to be fair to the SNP, we did have a white paper. It was about 600 pages long, a bit boring and repetitive, but we did have a white paper, and they had the detail at that time when we rejected it.
But you didn't have the detail, forgive me, Mr. Rennie, you didn't have any detail about Britain leaving the EU. Scots, in other words, did not know what they were voting on.
Yeah, well, we get an excuse every day of the week from the SNP as to why we should have another independence referendum, and you can't possibly have another independence referendum all the time. Whereas on Brexit, what we need to do is conclude this process democratically, because it is one of the biggest decisions that we've taken in a generation. Therefore, getting it right is incredibly important, and that's why we've got those different positions, because we're concluding a process, but we've already rejected a process in Scotland.
One last one, if I could. Yeah. You worked famously in the Scottish Parliament to form a coalition and alliance with the Labour Party. You worked with the Conservatives to form a coalition in Westminster. So presumably this talk of narrowing polls and hung parliaments and all the rest of it is music to the ears of a politician like you. You must want to do another deal.
No, we couldn't possibly, with something, again, so monumental as Brexit, with Jeremy Corbyn effectively backing up a hard Brexit of Theresa May, do a deal with either of them. So we'll do it vote by vote. We'll campaign on the issues to get a better deal on Brexit, to make sure we argue for that referendum that we crucially want, so the British people have the final say. So I'm afraid on this occasion, no, we're out.
No deals?
No.
Willie Rennie, leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, thank you. This is an election which, of course, didn't really have to happen. When she called it, Theresa May said it was all about Brexit. But the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Ruth Davidson, says it is in truth really about the future existence of the United Kingdom and staving off pressure from the SNP for another referendum on Scottish independence. So which election do voters just down the road from where I'm broadcasting in Glasgow, which do voters believe they're voting in?
My name's Paul Masterton. I'm the Scottish Conservative candidate for the general election next week.
For years past, no, for decades, being a Tory was not something many admitted to in Scotland, let alone boasted about. But could that be changing? If so, it should change here, in East Renfrewshire, in Glasgow's commuter belt. The party seen for so long as the party of Thatcher, a name still often spat out rather than spoken, the party that presided over the destruction of so much of Scotland's traditional industry, is reinventing itself as the party which will save the Union and stand up to the SNP.
Oh, sorry. Henry, come here. Henry. I would say new sort of Conservative as sort of really come on. It listens to the people a wee bit more, I would say now, than it certainly did, and that's why I'm torn now, because it goes against really what I've always sort of believed. I think, oh.
This is the new face of the Tories. Just 31 years old, Paul Masterton only joined the party after watching Scotland come close to voting for independence 3 years ago. He was just a toddler when Mrs Thatcher left Downing Street.
I'm under no illusions that there will be people walking into the polling booth, and if they're not actually holding their nose, will be taking a deep breath before marking the cross. These aren't natural Conservatives, they're people who want to send the SNP a message.
Tory dreams of a revival in Scotland may, of course, turn out to be just that. Polls predicting that they were on course to replace Labour as this country's second party and could win maybe half a dozen or even a dozen seats may go the way of those predictions of a Theresa May landslide. But many forget that this was once a land that did vote Conservative, or Unionists, as they called themselves back then.
It was polling day, and the electors of Kinross and West Perthshire were deciding whether Sir Alec Douglas-Home should represent them in Parliament.
When Alec Douglas-Home became Prime Minister, he fought and won a by-election in Scotland. His party had just secured more than 50% of Scottish votes. Professor Sir Tom Devine is a historian of the Scottish nation. He backs independence.
I'm not convinced that this is anything other than an anti-independence vote, but there's a new robustness among the Unionist people, determined to fight the fight, as it were, in a way probably they weren't even determined to fight in 2014.
This is Kirsten Oswald, your SNP candidate.
This is what the Tories are up against. The political tsunami which swept Scotland at the last election and which led this seat, Conservative for years, then Labour in the Blair and Brown years, to vote SNP. Kirsten Oswald never expected to become a Member of Parliament. Now she's fighting to stay in Westminster.
I've been round as many doors in East Renfrewshire as I possibly can. People are talking to me about Brexit and their worries about Theresa May. They're concerned that they don't think she's strong and stable. She may feel that. That's certainly not the message that I'm getting on the doorsteps of East Renfrewshire.
This, though, is not a two-horse race. This seat is being contested by the three big, or at least once big, parties.
Hello, Mr Walker, sorry to bother you. I'm Blair McDougall. I'm standing for Parliament on June the 8th.
Okay.
The Labour candidate here in East Renfrewshire is Mr No, Blair McDougall, who ran the anti-independence Better Together campaign. Along with the EU referendum, local, Holyrood and Westminster elections, he's asked people to come out and vote 7 times in the past 3 years.
The word they use over and over again is scunnered. If you've had enough of something, you're scunnered with it. So they're asking for a break. They are so sick and tired of voting. It's arguments about the Constitution, it's arguments about Brexit, and then the election after each of those referendums becomes an argument about what the referendum meant. So we never talk about their lives. That's what people feel.
Also runs here, but once a real force in Scottish politics, the Liberal Democrats. Their candidate is Eileen Morton.
The Liberal Democrats are really clear that they're for Scotland in the UK and the UK in Europe, and it's really important, I feel like, for us to be here and giving people that choice.
This election doesn't just sound, it looks very different when seen from Glasgow rather than from Westminster. It is a battle not just for who takes the keys to number 10 and who will form the opposition. It is a battle too about the shape and flavour of Scottish politics for years to come, its identity and its destiny. When this election was launched, there was much excited talk of a Tory landslide, helped by a Scottish Tory revival. In Ruth Davidson, it was said the party had found a popular cheerleader for keeping Scotland in the UK, the woman to challenge the SNP's Nicola Sturgeon and to replace Labour as the main opposition. Could all that talk, though, go the same way as the talk of a landslide? Ruth Davidson, leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, joins me from Pitlochry this morning. Good morning to you.
Morning to you, Nick.
You're known for being a straight speaker, not afraid to say what you really think. So what's gone wrong with your party's campaign?
Well, at the moment, we're in the mid-40s as we're polling, which is higher than Tony Blair got even in his 1993 landslide. Now, it's 1997 landslide, sorry. Now, it's fair to say that the Labour Party's poll has crept up. I think that's got an awful lot to do with a disastrous Liberal Democrat campaign. But here in Scotland, in terms of your introduction, we've already replaced Labour as the main opposition party. We moved into second place last year at the Scottish elections to become the chief opposition in Holyrood. We did the same just 3 weeks ago in the local government elections, and people right across Scotland, from the borders to Banffshire and back again, know that it's only the Scottish Conservatives that have the strength to take on the SNP here. So your message is it's going about as well as it could, really? Well, I have to say that I've been in this game a very long time, Nick. I've been leading this party now in Scotland for 5.5 years. I haven't seen an election yet, and I've fought 6 of them as leader, plus 2 referenda, where it hasn't been the media's job to start creating expectation about the result by saying that the polls have narrowed. And funnily enough, 2 weeks out, they started that narrative, and it's continuing through to polling day. But I think that people that have the experience need to hold their nerve, put your head down, keep working, because there is no substitute in an election for hard work. It's knock doors, it's speak to people, and it's make sure you get your message across. And on those doors, many people are very, very worried indeed about cuts being promised by the UK Conservative Party to pensioner benefits. Now, intriguingly, the Scottish Conservative Party, which you lead, say you will not cut pensioner benefits. You will keep the winter fuel allowance. Would your advice be to Theresa May that she should do another of those U-turns she seems more fond of now and do the same? Well, the issue is a devolved issue. So my colleagues down south, Theresa May and her team, have decided that it would be good to means test the winter fuel allowance, and any money that's saved is going to be put back into social care, so that there's no savings, if you like, it's reinvested elsewhere by the government. Now, in Scotland, we have a different social care model. So what I've decided, and this is what devolution allows us to do, is that within the envelope of spending that I have, is I've decided that we won't means test that. We'll make sure that pensioners continue, irrespective of their income level, to receive that winter fuel payment. Now, so you think it's fair for millionaires down the road in Glasgow, one side of the border or other? So I was just saying that it doesn't mean that there is more money being spent in one side of the border or the other. It's just being spent in other areas. And politics is about hard choices. This is the choice I choose to make. Hard choices and fairness, the Prime Minister tells us. So is it fair, you think it is, do you, for millionaires down the road here in Glasgow, in Edinburgh, maybe in Pitlochry, where you're speaking from, to get £200 or £300 a year to, put on another bar of their gas fire? Well, this is a decision that we've made, and we can have that debate. I'm asking you whether it's fair and right, if you like, and in Scotland. Well, yes, I think this is a universal benefit that people have always relied on. There are some benefits that are means tested and others which are not. I think when it comes to heating for the elderly, this is an area that I personally do not wish to see means tested, so I'm not going to make that choice. Now, the argument my colleagues make down south, and it is their right to do so because this is a devolved issue, is that they would rather spend that money in the social care sector. Sure, but in other words, you're saying it is fair and right and proper for wealthy people to keep their pensioner benefits, even though your Prime Minister is in favour of cutting them. Well, in Scotland, we've made a decision about some of the benefits that are available to older people. So, yes, we'll make sure across the UK that we'll keep the triple lock till 2020, double lock thereafter, so it never falls below the level again. We in Scotland will keep our pensioner benefits where it comes to television licences, where it comes to heating, where it comes to transport. Let's turn to Brexit. People across the UK came to know you, of course, because you're a very prominent Remainer, took part in that debate on Brexit. You said something very interesting about this election. You said that if there was a small Conservative majority, your phrase, not mine, the Brexiteer bastards
would influence the Prime Minister. What are you worried about?
No, actually, I was asked a question. I wouldn't use that language in public. Maybe in private, Nick, but not in public. I was asked a question by a journalist. It was a reference to what John Major had said about having a very small majority,
and you said
but
you were
having
worried.
A persistent group of rebels. And I said that I wanted the Prime Minister to have the space within the House of Commons to be able to make decisions for the good of the country without having to be held for ransom, if you like, by either side of the aisle.
So, in other words, Tory hardline
Brexiters,
you're worried about?
No, I'm worried about any caucuses within the Commons that may choose to try and influence the Prime Minister in either way, because this is a massive challenge that's coming up in the next 2 years. I want the Prime Minister to have the maximum manoeuvrability in order to get the best deal for the country. I want the rest of the EU, as we approach these negotiations, to see a Prime Minister that has gone to the public and got the mandate that her opponents challenged her to get. I want to see a Prime Minister that can sit down eyeball to eyeball with Angela Merkel and say, look, we are one team UK and we want the best deal for our country, and that's what I'm supporting at this election.
Well, help us out then. What is Conservative immigration policy? Is it to cut immigration to tens of thousands, or is it what you said, which is that you wanted to stay in the single market even if that meant maintaining free movement of labour?
Well, I campaigned for Remain. Of course I wanted to stay within the single market. That's what I was campaigning for. That's what I voted for. But
you said that after the referendum, not just during the referendum. You said it afterwards.
17.5 million people. Yep, and I wanted to have a free trade agreement. I'm a centre-right politician. I want the ability of Scots and UK businesses to trade freely abroad. Now, the Prime Minister in her Lancaster House speech, where she set out the ideas for the way in which we'll tackle this, made sure that a comprehensive free trade agreement was front and centre of what she was trying to achieve from the Brexit negotiations. Now, we can quibble about the framework, but if the end result is the ability of Scottish and British businesses to trade freely, then of course I support the Prime Minister in
Isn't
that.
the truth though,
to go back to your question on immigration.
Yep.
If I could go back to your question on immigration, if I may, Nick.
Sure.
You asked what the policy is. The policy is to bring down net migration to the tens of thousands. Yep. Now, what the Prime Minister is saying is that at the moment, in 27 countries around the world, we don't get to decide what happens, because it's decided at a Brussels level. As those powers come back here, we need to organise a managed migration system that will bring immigration down over time, while still saying that we're a welcoming country, while still promoting ourselves to the brightest and best around the world, and ensuring that any gaps in our labour market can be suitably met, as well as increasing training at home.
The truth is, you've given in to the Brexiteers, haven't you? You used to say we want to stay in the single market, and you said it after the referendum. Now you don't. You used to say that you wanted free movement of people. You said that after the referendum. Now you don't. The truth is, you've given up the fight, and the Brexiteers you warned of, they're already running the Conservative Party and will if you win the next election.
That's absolute nonsense, Nick. What we did was, as a country, say that this decision over Brexit was so big, it was a decision that wasn't going to be made by politicians alone. It was a decision that had to be made by each and every individual voter, and whatever the result was, it would be respected. Now, I fought hard for my side. I put the points across. I made the argument for Remain, and the country voted to leave. Now, we have a really strong example in Scotland of a nationalist First Minister who's had a referendum, again, where we said the decision was so big that it had to go to the country, not just politicians, and she said that she would respect the result, and she hasn't. And she's tried to replay it again and again and again until she gets the result she wants. Now,
and we'll
I stand
be talking
up against
to her
that.
at 10 past
I stand
8.
full square for I'm sure you will, but I stand full square for the decision we made. It would not be right or proper for me to then say in this other referendum where the country made a decision for us not to say that decision should be respected.
We've got to leave it there. Ruth Davidson, thank you very much indeed. We'll use the SNP to give us power, says Labour. That is the headline in today's Times. That is not, of course, actually what Labour have said. But the party has started to answer questions about what it would do if some, and note, it is only some, opinion polls are right that suggest there could be a hung parliament. Labour says it would not try to form a coalition in Westminster, but instead form a minority government and rely on the support of other parties. The SNP would be likely to be the biggest of those. And that sharp intake take a breath. You heard the laughter came from Scotland's First Minister and leader of the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Nice to be here in Glasgow with you this morning. Will you help Labour to get into power if it's a possibility?
Let's go. I suppose all election outcomes are hypothetical during a campaign, so I can't really dodge it on that basis. I've said very clearly, I said this many times during the 2015 election, that if there was to be a hung parliament, if the parliamentary arithmetic allowed it, then I would want the SNP to be part of a progressive alternative to a Conservative government. Not in a coalition. I don't envisage any formal coalitions, but on an issue-by-issue basis to put forward progressive policies and see a progressive agenda. And we see some of the parties in this election, not least Labour, putting forward policies that the SNP have already implemented in Scotland. So that's my position, and my position on that hasn't changed.
Just to be clear how that would work. I mean, I know you may wish to say it would not, but how it would work is this, that in a week's time, you would have talks with Jeremy Corbyn, and you would say, Mr Corbyn, I will not come into power with you, but if providing you're implementing the sort of policies that we in the SNP believe in and put to the people, we'll vote for you and we will keep you in power.
We would look at that on an issue-by-issue basis. I think the other point I would make is, well, two points I would make. Firstly, if we are in that scenario, and the second point I'm about to make is to be sceptical about whether we will be in that scenario, but the first point I would make is that if that scenario arises, then it means that the electorate has decided that it doesn't want either of the two main UK parties to govern with a free hand. And of course the SNP has got experience of minority government because we were a minority government in Scotland in 2007 to 2011. But the second point really is to be sceptical about this. And, you know, as I said earlier on, I recognise when you're in an election campaign, it's all hypothetical in terms of the outcomes. But when I look at the polls right now, I certainly see in the rest of the UK a significant narrowing of the polls. But my reading of the polls says that Theresa May and the Tories are still on track to win this election. But they are no longer certain to get a bigger majority in this election. And actually, in that scenario, Scotland becomes centre stage and potentially has a pivotal and decisive role to play, because it could be the case that what determines whether or not Theresa May has a bigger majority is the outcome of the election in Scotland. And that's my key message. Let's not elect Tory MPs to be rubber stamps for Theresa May. Let's make sure we've got SNP MPs standing up for Scotland.
Well, I want to ask you about the role of SNP MPs in just a second. One last one, and I accept, of course, it's hypothetical, but it's important because it could happen in less than a week's time. It's an if. But how would it work? You've experience of doing it in Scotland as a minority government. You would have talks, would you not? You would talk with Jeremy Corbyn. There'd be talks with the Labour Party.
I'm sure there'd be all sorts of talks if that was to happen.
Tell us your programme, you'd say, and we'll tell you what we can back.
Again, I mean, I think in an election campaign, I guess this is not to the forefront of people's minds, but when we're on the other side of an election campaign, and if a scenario like this has arisen, it's because that's what the electorate wants. They want parties to talk to each other. So the idea that parties would refused to do that, I think, would be flying in the face of what the electorate had wanted. But again, I come back to the reality. The most likely outcome here is a Tory victory, but a Tory victory no longer certain of an increased majority. So Scotland could constrain and keep a Tory government in check by making sure we don't throw Theresa May a lifeline.
Well, that's the key thing, while you're still trying to persuade people to actually vote rather than talking about what they might do. So let's talk about that then. You say, well, let's have more SNP votes and let's have more SNP MPs in Westminster because we can stand up to the Tories. I put it to you, you're never going to be in a stronger position than you are now. You have a Tory party with a very small majority, and you have as many MPs as anyone could possibly fantasise the SNP
Well, actually,
having.
there was three we didn't win, so I could fantasise about having more.
OK, but, well, there's a prediction for you, 59.
It's not a prediction, let me just say, it's not a prediction.
But I put it to you that in many ways, and this is not your fault, it's just the nature of the arithmetic, you are irrelevant in Westminster. They can ignore your pleas on Brexit, they can ignore your complaints. Why not vote Labour and get a Labour government instead?
Well, Labour's not strong enough in Scotland to challenge the Tories. At the last general election 2 years ago, the SNP was first or second in every single constituency. So a vote for Labour in Scotland is actually a vote to split the anti-Tory vote and run the risk of letting Tories in the back door. That's why people who don't want a Tory government with a bigger majority have to vote SNP on Thursday. But the point about the relevance and the impact of SNP MPs is a very fair and legitimate question. But I think even the SNP's harshest critic would say that we've been anything but irrelevant in a Westminster context. The SNP's not been the official opposition over the past 2 years, but my goodness, it's been the effective opposition. Week after week, it's been Angus Robertson who has taken on the Prime Minister, and it has been SNP MPs leading the charge on issues like the two-child tax credit policy, the rape clause, the WASPy women, leading the charge that led to a reversal of the national insurance increase. So it's been SNP MPs leading the way, and we've got to keep that strong voice.
And yet you said to the government, look, we want a role in forming Brexit strategy, we want a separate strategy to keep Scotland in the single market, and the Tories ignored you on that.
Well, yeah, but there's
now
a
Labour say that they would keep Britain in the single market. Surely the logic, if they could, the logic is to try to have a Labour government.
Well,
not waste your vote on the SNP.
First thing, that's not Labour's position, with the greatest of respect. Jeremy Corbyn says explicitly that because he wants to end free movement, something that would be damaging to the Scottish economy, he accepts that the UK would come out of the single market. So that's not their position. Secondly, as I said earlier on, to vote Labour in Scotland, given that Labour is not strong enough to beat the Tories, you actually risk letting in Tory MPs. But the substantive point you asked me here about the Brexit negotiations, you're right, the Prime Minister, when she took office, said she wanted to listen to all the different nations of the UK and come to a common position. She then failed to do that. We put forward compromise proposals that would have kept, hopefully the UK, but certainly Scotland in the single market, and she brushed those aside. But she has called an election. And an election gives people the opportunity in Scotland to give those proposals democratic legitimacy. And that's why I'm saying to people, whether they voted Leave or Remain, that if they back the SNP, they give me a mandate to strengthen Scotland's hand in those negotiations to make sure we don't end up with an outcome that puts tens of thousands of Scottish jobs on the line.
Now, how many elections have you fought or campaigns have you fought since you became
leader?
In my life. A couple of years ago.
Well, I've been, in fact, I hadn't been conscious of this until I read it on a BBC profile piece a couple of weeks ago, that I've been SNP leader now for, I think, about 2.5 years, and this is my 4th election campaign.
And there's been the EU referendum as well.
And the EU
look,
referendum.
You could give yourself a rest, and for once and all, so you'll put a paid to the idea of another Scottish independence referendum, because you've done enough campaigning. As we heard someone earlier in the programme, Scottish voters are scunnered. They've had enough.
Scottish, I think there is a sense that people feel there's been a lot of big choices to be made, and I understand that as somebody who's very actively engaged in these things. I absolutely understand that, and I guess if I was only thinking about my own interests, I'd maybe opt for that rest.
Hey, look, one of your candidates today obviously feels that's what the voters want to hear. He's put out an advert in the East Lothian Courier. This election is not about independence.
The point George is making...
People don't like what you're saying on that, do they?
The point George is making is this, and it's the point I'm making, and let me just set it out because it is fundamentally important. At the end of the Brexit process, not right now, but at the end of that process, I think people in Scotland should have a choice about our future, because the alternative to that is that we simply have to accept the outcome of that process, no matter how damaging it's going to be to jobs, investment, our public finances, our public services. And I don't think we should be in the position... But the end is not what
you originally said, is it? You originally said we wanted a referendum before Brexit is through. Then you said spring 19. Now you're saying sometime.
Well, I've said consistently at the end of the process. The spring 19 is what Theresa May is currently telling us will be the end of the process.
But you accept it could be a lot longer.
Well, I accepted previously that if that time... I'm not in charge of the Brexit timetable. If that is longer, then so too would my thinking about the timing of a choice for Scotland.
One last one to you. I put it to you that one of the reasons Scottish voters are saying to you, I'm not sure we want another referendum quite so soon, thank you very much, is because of another thing we've been talking about on this programme a lot. Scotland's economy has challenges. You know, there was a fall in output of 0.2% compared with growth in the UK as a whole. There is talk of a £15 billion black hole if you went ahead and had independence. Isn't it time to worry about that rather than worrying about how you can rush back to the polls?
I worry and focus on that every single day as First Minister. Firstly, let me just say that there are many reasons to be positive about the Scottish economy. And of course, we saw last week the UK become the slowest growing country in the G7. But unemployment in Scotland is lower than it is in the rest of the UK. Productivity is growing at a faster rate. But in terms of Scotland's fiscal position, that's not because we're independent. It's as a feature of being governed by Westminster, and the Office of National Statistics actually published some figures last week which I think illustrate this point. When you take London and the South East out of the equation, then the deficit of Scotland is the same as the deficit of the UK overall proportionately. What that says is the UK economy is imbalanced, and what we need to see are different parts of the UK having more powers to grow our economy. And of course, independence or greater economic powers would give Scotland the ability to do that.
First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, thanks very much
Thank
indeed
you.
for joining us. And alongside you in this Glasgow studio, Sarah Smith, our Scotland political editor. It is a very different election seen from here as against seen from Westminster, Sarah.
It is. Across the UK, of course, it's the Brexit election, whereas a big issue in Scotland is the question of Scottish independence, as you were just asking the First Minister about there. And in fact, one of the things the parties are trying to do in this election is define what it's about. The SNP, you heard the First Minister there, was talking about the challenges Brexit might bring to Scotland, whereas when you spoke to Ruth Davidson, the Scottish Tory leader, earlier, she was much more keen to talk about independence. This is where they see their advantages lie. The Tories hope that by making independence absolutely central to the campaign, they can solidify a unionist and anti-independent vote to try and get people to beat SNP candidates. The SNP have stopped talking so much about independence to talk about Scotland's choices and being able to decide Scotland's own future rather than making independence the real focus of the campaign.
It is one of the great ironies of this campaign here, isn't it? Which is the SNP, their paper, The National, has a front-page photograph of Ruth Davidson, the Scottish Tory leader, obsessed, it says, saying, why are the Tories banging on about independence? And the SNP, the party of independence, seems mighty keen not to talk about it very much.
Well, and it was, of course, the reason we're talking about it is because it was Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, who just a couple of months ago said we ought to have another referendum on independence because of the result of the Brexit referendum and because of the fears she has of what leaving the single market would do to Scotland. The other interesting thing, of course, is whilst we're having this argument, it's very much between the SNP and the Tories. You heard Nicola Sturgeon there saying Labour's not strong enough. This is a fight between the SNP and the Tories. The Tories want to cast it that way as well, and that leaves Labour and the Liberal Democrats really without a voice in this election.
We're exploring the election as seen from Scotland this morning, finding out how the constitutional argument is an inescapable part of it. A man who knows much more about it, of course, than me is our special correspondent, Jim Naughtie. And to get a bird's-eye view of the battlefield, he got himself high over Edinburgh.
Looking from the top of this volcanic height, I reckon, depending where you stand here or over in Salisbury Crags, you can see bits of at least a dozen constituencies. You can count mountaintops as well, but that's unfair because there are only sheep up there. But on the Edinburgh City panoply itself, just below us, 3 seats are especially interesting.
1, 4, 5 and 6.
Good morning. I'm calling on behalf of the Labour candidate.
Edinburgh South, the only Labour seat in Scotland. Next to it, Edinburgh South West, and to its north, Edinburgh West, both held by the SNP. Of all the seats I can look into here, right across the landscape, only one is not nationalist territory. So what's going on?
The question is how best we send the SNP a message. At this election, it's only by voting for Ruth Davidson's Scottish Conservatives.
Well, the Conservative campaign focuses on one question. Should there be another independence referendum or not? They say no. Labour and the Liberal Democrats are singing the same song.
Hi, this is Scottish Liberal Democrats.
So what does that mean? A quiet coalition of the willing and the determined. The Conservatives won't try too hard in Edinburgh South, hoping that Labour will hold off the SNP. Labour will let the Conservatives make the running against the Nationalists in Edinburgh South West. And in Edinburgh West, held by the Liberal Democrats during the coalition, Labour and the Tories will let them get on with it. As people in more than one party have said to me, you may well say that. I couldn't possibly comment. This leads you straight to the fact that there is more than one election going on in the UK. In England, it's different from the contest in Northern Ireland and in Wales, and getting more distinct every day in Scotland. The pollster Mark Diffley of Ipsos Mori on his experience trying to track Scottish politics.
Broadly, Scotland is just a much more inherently politically interesting country. I moved here 17 years ago. Looking at it now from 2000, it's just absolutely night and day. You had Labour, Lib Dem kind of coalition, Labour hegemony that everyone talked about. Sometimes you have to kind of sort of take a bit of a step back and think, it just doesn't feel like the same country now that it did then.
The obvious reason is that Labour domination has shrivelled to the point where, against the dominant SNP, with 50% of the vote in 2015, they're struggling to compete.
Perhaps up to about a quarter of Scots now voting Labour. Now, that might not seem very many, but actually, if they do get somewhere around 24-25%, that means they've kind of flatlined. Now, they would absolutely settle for flatlining at the moment, given the sort of broader narrative that's going on.
And of course, it's about the Constitution, stupid. Professor Charlie Jeffrey, Fellow of the Centre on the Constitution at Edinburgh University.
What we've got in the UK now is an unusual set of political structures which are what some would call asymmetrical, that there's no uniformity to the pattern, and that's likely to persist in the coming years. So the relationship of Scotland to Westminster will be distinctive and probably looser. Likewise in Northern Ireland, distinctive and probably looser, but bound up in relationships with the Republic of Ireland. We'll see what happens in Wales, but perhaps London will also develop more fully some distinctive political structures.
It follows that although the general election in Scotland may be fought on different grounds, this is going to affect the whole of the UK.
This is a constitution whose destination point is quite unclear. What I think we can be clear about is that the relationships between the whole and the parts is going to become looser.
The election here reminds you that it isn't a simple UK decision next Thursday, where the arguments are the same everywhere. To put it simply, social care costs, GP commissioning in the NHS, tuition fees, among many others, are legislated for quite differently by the Scottish Parliament. People in Berwick, in England, and those a few miles along the northern bank of the Tweed in Coldstream, in Scotland, live in countries with different regimes. Charlie Jeffrey of Edinburgh University.
We can certainly anticipate powers in agriculture and fisheries to some extent to be devolved. Nicola Sturgeon has made a strong case, which is widely supported across the political spectrum in Scotland, for powers in the field of immigration. We'll see if that happens. But you could also imagine something similar being put forward by Sadiq Khan in London to embed the strength of the financial services sector in this new context after Brexit.
The historian and writer Michael Fry was, and would still say he is, a free market conservative, but he voted yes to independence in 2014 and believes in a separate Scotland.
Scotland doesn't know what to do next. The whole thing is a complete puzzle, and every way forward seems fraught with such difficulties. As soon as you think that might be a good idea, the disadvantages occur to you, so you turn to another course.
In other words, Scots are on a mountain trek and they're only in the foothills.
They're only the foothills. The path is very muddy. There are storms coming on. But even so, people are not saying, let's head back to that comfy little hut that we had before 1999.
Storms coming. You can see it all in the landscape of constituencies below me. A Conservative revival, certainly strong enough to disturb the SNP, and a titanic battle still between Labour and the Nationalists. Jamie Kerr, an immigration lawyer, was a serious Labour figure, a candidate in the last election, who left to join the SNP 2 months ago, driven out by the implications of Brexit.
What's at the heart of this election is the democratic deficit that the Brexit vote has very clearly laid out, where we're in a position that Scotland, like Northern Ireland, are about to be taken out of Europe against their will, so we can have as much devolution as we wish. But more fundamental is that Scotland's about to be pulled in a direction that the electorate does not want to go in.
These are the questions lurking in the heart of the election in Scotland. A referendum that isn't on the ballot paper, but is in everyone's minds. Parties opposed to it who are happy to cooperate on the quiet without saying anything. A nationalist movement that knows that their dominance can't last forever. Questions that everyone can see as if they're etched on this great skyline around me, but to which we won't have answers until long, long after this vote next week has come and gone.
Jim Naughtie reporting there. And joining me in the studio in Glasgow, Kezia Dugdale, leader of the Scottish Labour Party. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Nick.
Are you seeing the Corbyn surge?
There's definitely evidence in the polls over the last 10 days or so of an edging up in the Labour vote across Scotland. And actually there was an even bigger poll a matter of weeks ago when every single council across Scotland was out in the local government elections, and it was clear from those results that in the vast majority of towns and cities across Scotland, Labour polled a strong second place to the SNP, which demonstrates the only way to stop the SNP and to oppose a second independence referendum is to vote Labour on June the 8th.
We'll talk about your position on independence in just a second, but there's a curiosity here, isn't there? Jeremy Corbyn, when he did that debate the other day, spelt out the 3 big reasons for voting Labour: protect pensioners, protect the NHS, get rid of student fees. None of them apply in Scotland. All of those issues are devolved.
Oh, how I would love for this election in Scotland to be about those issues around living standards and investment in public services. But once again, it's dominated by the Constitution. Jim's package has just outlined to you just how strong a force that is. If anything, though, it missed one element, and that's the tangible anger there is in Scotland at being asked this question again. Even the prospect of a second independence referendum leaves people just beyond belief with anger.
But your difficulty then is that people think if they are angry about that, and there is clearly some evidence of that, well, look, there is one party is absolutely clearly the party of the Union, more clearly than any other, and that is the Conservative Party. That is your old ally in politics years ago,
Never
but
an
now
ally.
anyway, Ruth Davidson. She is the one who's speaking up for it, and they don't think you are.
See, I just don't accept that, because when I reflect in the last 2.5 years, many of the problems that Scotland faces, many of the realities as to why the support for Yes has grown, have been caused by the Conservative Party. Whether that was David Cameron on the doorsteps of Number 10 calling for English votes for English laws, whether that was the Tories' attack on welfare and social security that's left very many working poor people in Scotland worse off, whether that's the gamble over Brexit full stop, the very fact that Nicola Sturgeon has found the excuse she was always going to look for to pursue a second independence referendum. On each and every occasion, the Tories' decisions has been what has undermined the Union, and it turns to Labour once again to stand up for the United Kingdom as the best mechanism to redistribute both power and wealth across this country.
But your position in the Labour Party on another referendum is ambiguous, isn't it?
Not
on the
at
one
all.
hand, the manifesto is clear. You say Labour opposes a second Scottish independence referendum. On the other hand, your leader in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, says, what I've said is if the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish people want a referendum, they have a right to do that.
Jeremy Corbyn has been abundantly clear. Every single time he's in Scotland and across the United Kingdom, it is in his own words and his own manifesto as well, a second independence referendum is unnecessary and unwanted.
But every
Further
time he
than
comes
that,
here, you end up clearing up the mess because he says, look, if people want it there, sure, give them the chance.
Look, Jeremy Corbyn is an authentic champion for anti-austerity politics. And because he's that anti-austerity champion, that's why he's such a powerful advocate against independence. Because he knows, as I do, as the vast majority of Scots do, because bear in mind, they voted no just 2.5 years ago, independence would mean £15 billion worth of additional cuts on top of the Tory austerity we're already faced with.
So if there were to be a government in Westminster, a Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn, can you guarantee that it would not agree to a second independence referendum?
Jeremy Corbyn has said no independence referendum. He is very much against independence. He's
I'll
also
read you his
ruled
words
out...
again. He says if the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish people want it, they have a right to do it. And then he goes on to say that the timing would be after the Brexit negotiations. That's perfectly possible for the next Labour government to do it then.
He has been very clear, as is the manifesto, we are against independence and a second independence referendum because of the austerity it would cause, those further cuts that would hurt the very people Jeremy Corbyn wants to serve in office.
Now, the reason for the confusion, I put it to you, is because, frankly, you're no great fan of Mr Corbyn. When he ran against Owen Jones for the Labour leadership, you described him as not competent to do the job.
Owen Smith. I think Owen Jones.
Forgive me, Owen Jones is, of course, a well-known Guardian columnist who comes on this programme quite a lot. Owen Smith,
it's
indeed.
Quite an elevation, although I'm sure
My
you'd be
apologies to both of
fantastic.
them. But you did, weren't you? You were very clear. You were quite rude about Mr Corbyn. He's not competent to do the job, you said.
Look, I took part in a democratic contest, which was the Labour leadership last summer. I offered my view on the contest, and that contest concluded and returned Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party across the United Kingdom. And I, like many others, have done nothing but offered that united front since.
But have you seen anything since that makes you think he is competent?
Actually, do you know what I see in Jeremy Corbyn? And I noticed this most profoundly when I went to the UK manifesto launch in Bradford, is that the very people in this country who desperately need a Labour Prime Minister love him. Why? because he's standing on a manifesto which, with just one policy, can lift 5.6 million people out of in-work poverty tomorrow with a real living wage of £10 an hour. That's worth fighting for.
Isn't it possible, you see, that when he is, as I put it to you, a bit ambiguous about this Scottish second referendum, he has one eye on what Nicola Sturgeon has told us this morning. She has an eye on, which is a progressive alliance, a minority Labour government supported by the SNP.
He has absolutely 100% refuted any prospect of a deal, a coalition or a pact with the SNP for two fundamental reasons. One, he doesn't believe that the SNP are a progressive party, so you can't have a progressive alliance with a party, for example, that refuses to tax the rich and ask them to pay their fair share. Also, Jeremy Corbyn accepts there's nothing progressive about trying to break up the United Kingdom. That is the means by which we redistribute wealth. We want to be able to tax wealth in London and the South East and redistribute it across the United Kingdom according to need.
You're not suggesting, though, are you, because you couldn't, that Jeremy Corbyn would willingly hand the keys of number 10 back to Theresa May rather than take the votes of the SNP in Westminster to get Labour legislation passed?
Look, what would happen is very simple. There will be a Labour budget presented and rooted in the manifesto put before the people. Within that, there will be those plans for a real living wage, investment in public services, tax measures to ask the richest people in society to pay their fair share. At that moment, it is for the SNP to decide whether they back it or not. If they choose not to back it, all they do is allow the Tories back in. The choice is theirs.
There's one thing you could do to put this whole thing to bed, and some Labour candidates have done it around the country, so there's not the faintest chance of Jeremy Corbyn winning. The polls are wrong. We don't think this is happening. We want as many votes as we can. Of course we do. But he's not going to get there. Would you say that?
Well, the polls seem to suggest very much that we're on track for a Labour government next week. If it creeps up in the same pattern that it has done over the last 10 days, then that real living wage of £10 an hour, that investment in the NHS is within grasp.
Even if the next Prime Minister is, in your words, incompetent?
The only way you can get a Labour government next week is by voting Labour, and every single vote for the SNP is wasted in that regard.
Kezia Dugdale, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
This morning we have been taking the temperature of the election as seen from north of the border, where, of course, the constitutional issue, the great national question, the question of independence and whether there should be a second referendum, has dominated much of the campaigning. Two men who know how campaigns are run and understand them, but are no longer directly involved, join me now for some final thoughts. Kevin Bringle, former SNP Director of Communications, now columnist in the Sunday Times. Ramsay Jones, who was a special advisor on Scotland to David Cameron and now writes for the Press and Journal. Good morning to you both.
Good morning. Good morning.
Who is getting their strategy right here? First of all, Ramsay, is it right for the Tories to bang on about independence as they're accused, so much so that the SNP backing newspaper here, The National, has a picture of Ruth Davidson and says obsessed on the front cover?
Which was quite an irony given that paper's obsession with independence in its own banner, but leaving that to one side. Yes, it is, because it was the First Minister who decided only sort of minutes, hours after the Brexit vote that independence was back on the table. It was going to happen. It was very much still the raison d'etre of the Scottish National Party. And they have spent so much time debating, talking, trying to force Scottish public opinion to want a second independence referendum, that of course it has to become a defining issue here in this part of the general election here in Scotland.
This is only a short-term strategy, though, isn't it? If the Tories are to revive, and I was reminding people that they once had a majority of all the votes in this country back in the 1950s, they can't do so purely on the basis of saying we're the main unionist party.
Well, you can until the point comes where the Constitution is taken off the table, and that's the point. The desire of the electorate in Scotland is to move on to the real bread and butter issues of politics. That can only be done when the Constitution stops being the issue, and then Scotland can start to have that battle centre-left, centre-right. And again, that may well be SNP versus Tory.
And Kevin, there's the sign that you're part of the SNP are just a bit itchy about this independence question. The timetable keeps moving back. They don't want to talk about it. There's one candidate, I was quoting to Nicola Sturgeon, even taking an ad out in the paper to say this is not about independence, this election.
Well, there's an irony in this election in that the SNP are contesting the general election in UK terms, and the Conservative Party are contesting it in terms of the Scottish Constitution, which is generally the opposite of what it's always been. I think the way the SNP are pursuing the campaign is, well, A, it's relevant to the nature of the contest. It is a UK-wide general election, but also politically, as we're in this final week, as the polls have tightened, actually potentially, and I picked this up from Nicola Sturgeon's interview earlier on, potentially makes the SNP very important in these final few days. The SNP has always struggled in UK countrywide elections to be able to demonstrate relevance. But if the polls are, as some indicate, and the arithmetic in the House of Commons is going to be tight, a small majority, maybe no majority, then the SNP's message in these final few days of vote SNP to give Scotland a strong voice, we could make the difference on a whole series of issues, on ending austerity, for example, more investment in NHS. Well, that's the stuff of this election. So it may be, time will tell, but it may be that the Tories focusing on the Scottish Constitution is to some extent beside the point.
But Ramsay Jones, thinking back to your old colleagues inside Number 10, they will be delighted at headlines in the Times, which are based, let's remember, on one or two polls by one company, and many other companies don't think it's close to being a hung parliament. They'll be absolutely delighted that this prospect that was used so brutally against Ed Miliband at the last election is in the headlines again.
Well, it's in play, and I heard the interview with the First Minister with yourself earlier on today, Nick, and it pains to say, albeit in her terms issue by issue, she wants to cut a deal with Jeremy Corbyn. For her, it's all about being anti-Tory. That is the way she's been running this whole campaign. But the truth is the polls give Tory leads from 3 to 13, 15, 16%. But the polls in Scotland are telling us 2 or 3 important things. One, the people don't want another independence referendum anytime soon. They would still reject independence. And in vast numbers of seats across Scotland, it's either Ruth Davidson or Nicola Sturgeon. They're the choices.
Now, neither are Labour, but is it not possible, neither of you are Labour, but is it not possible, Kevin Bringle, that voters may think, if it's getting closer, we should vote Labour in order to try and get that Labour government?
I don't think so, because whatever the polls say, none of them say a Labour government. Some of them say a Tory government with a small majority. The Times survey this week indicated possibly no majority. So I think that creates the context for what's the most effective voice for Scotland. Now, the SNP would obviously argue the biggest possible group of SNP MPs. I guess Ramsay and the Tories would argue an enhanced Tory group, but that's the nature of the context. I think we agree.
I think we agree on that, but one thought on that. The thing that does annoy me is this sort of assumed monopoly of speaking for Scotland the SNP adopt. Not true. All Scottish politicians care about Scotland passionately.
Well, Ramsay Jones and Kevin Bringle, I'm going to end with 5 seconds each of a prediction. You're not pollsters. In this sense, you know nothing. What's going to happen?
Squeaky bum time for quite a lot of senior nationalists.
That is a quote from Sir Alex Ferguson, so you know.
A very, very small Tory majority in which a combined opposition aligned with Tory rebels on some issues could actually make a very substantial difference.